Castlevania is one of my favorite games. Not only that, it's one of my favorite series. I played the first as a child, unaware I should fear Dracula and his army of darkness. Castlevania gave us Simon Belmont an entire slew of monsters to slay with his magic whip. It was one of my first platformers. At the age of 3, I played Super Mario Bros., Mega Man, Blaster Master, and Contra, failing my way nowhere with a child's ease. 7 years later, when I was a bit better at gaming, Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy 6, 7, Tactics, and Mega Man X4 grabbed my heart. Among those games, though, came a new Castlevania. And though it had no whip, no pits, and I hadn't played an entry since the NES, I had to play it. Over the years, I found that the entertainers I loved before one or the other. Classic Castlevania, Classicvania, or its newer incarnation, the Metroidvania. After hearing the discussion in multiple videos over the course of a month in 2013, I decided to tackle what I found was the most prevalent topic of conversation in said discussions. Is classic Castlevania better than Symphony of the Night?
One feels like it has more purpose. Everything has purpose.
And
Symphony of the Night's just kind of like, there's a lot
of
stuff
I get it.
in
It's
it
one is better,
matter.
yeah. No, one is like I know what you mean.
Castlevania's iconic story has been video game legend for decades, being remade by the company twice, even 3 times if you count Lords of Shadow. In both Super Castlevania 4 and Castlevania Chronicles, it's 1691, and the vampire hunter Simon Belmont is on a quest to defeat the ultimate evil, Count Dracula. It's a linear work of platforming magic that not only does the NES controller justice, but has also been one of the most prominent examples of amazing game design that I've quoted to friends or used as an example many a time in my more recent life. Not only does this game teach through example, its difficulty ramps up exponentially as it takes advantage of Simon's inability to say, whip diagonally. And the first level alone, no. The first segment, without a manual, the game provides a safe teaching environment to introduce the player to its simple mechanics. Outside of Dracula's castle, 5 torches lay in your path. They contain 2 hearts, 2 chain upgrades for the whip, and the dagger sub-weapon. Though time ticks down against you unnecessarily, I mean, who's ever gotten a time over in a Castlevania? There are no enemies here. You're free to whip and flail and jump to your heart's content, learning which of the 2 red buttons makes you jump and which of the 2 red buttons makes you whip. In providing this first safe haven, it's easy to see that the hearts are indeed ammo for your sub-weapon, the jump is immediate and impossible to change in mid-air, and the whip takes half a second to fire up. In the first level, it's easy to see that Simon is outclassed. The zombies are faster than you, the black leopards are faster than you, the bats are faster than you. The flight paths of these enemies take full advantage of Simon's inability to whip diagonally, down, up, or even behind him in a timely manner. The entire challenge of Castlevania is getting around the program's shortcomings, the short whip range and dedicated jump arcs. Everything moves with a greater dexterity, attack variance, and all around outshines you. And the programmers did this on purpose. This isn't enemies flying in from off-screen at you super fast like the myriad other ridiculous games of this era. This isn't unexplained controls. When Konami made Gradius in 1985, it controlled well. Attacks came out as you pressed a button, and it responded like it should have. Castlevania presents you the challenge of getting to Dracula, of getting around his hokey, aggravating minions and defeating his jolly monster mashup lineup of bosses until you go toe-to-toe with the man himself. The sub-weapons allow Simon and the player to avert the decidedly destitute controls and forge a path through the castle. The dagger, though weak, gives Simon a long-range attack that can sometimes be the difference between making a surprising jump and getting tossed in a lake. The axe's arcing upward path is useful against airborne enemies and those on a higher platform than you are currently on. Along with being ridiculously useful and almost necessary to even beat the game, the sub-weapons are programmed drops within certain candles, often at checkpoints before boss fights. Everything presented to the player has a purpose, from the cross rosary that decimates everything on screen to the invincibility oil. Every encounter of the game is a test of skill, a test of patience, and sometimes a bit of luck. It's the epitome of understanding the extent of your abilities and using them to your advantage against a stacked deck. As far as anything on the NES goes, this is a masterpiece. Despite being outshined by other games in the series, it still holds up to this day. The apex of the game is Stage 5's infamous final corridor, a summation of fleamen, skeletons, axe warriors, bone pillars, and Medusa heads culminating in a boss fight with Death, who is almost always notorious for being featured at what seems like the most inopportune time, the end of the longest, hardest level. Playing until this point has been more or less about learning patience, movement, and how to combat enemies, along with how to wield each sub-weapon. Stage 5 is also arguably the longest, with the most screen changes and length of screen scrolling throughout. Stage 2 is a screen very similar before its Medusa boss fight, with Medusa heads bobbing in to attack you, but it's a virtual cakewalk compared to 5's Medusa head axe armor combo with heads coming in from both sides, axes on high and low, and a punishing stretch to the boss fight that requires both sweet and utter perfection. And then there's Death, the second to last hardest boss in the game. Of everything Castlevania teaches you about itself beforehand, of its inflexibility and jumping mechanics, attack delay, sub-weapon limit, and movement speed, the battle with Death comes across as the peak of gameplay to this point. It's for these reasons that I hold Castlevania in such high regard. It's a difficult action platformer that gives the players limitations, but introduces enemies that can do so much more to counter you, offering one the chance to best the game in a show of skill and a devastating early era of Nintendo hard. However, despite how strongly I feel about it, despite being given the appropriate weapons at the right times for many challenges, every stage beyond the first is a labyrinth of enemies, holes, one-hit kill traps, and inane boss design that lends itself better to an older teenage player or adult player mindset, with the means and wherewithal to learn patterns, anticipate movement, and the ability to remember various enemy trap placement. Entire sets of lives can be lost to being baited into enemy placements that knock you back into holes, or the fact that jumping from moving platforms doesn't maintain momentum, so jumping upwards is almost always a death waiting to happen. Ascending or descending stairs leave you vulnerable without an axe or an enemy on the same level as your whip attack. Castlevania is a solid entry in the franchise, though difficult, stiff, and downright ridiculously hard. Mastering its jumping arc, delayed attacks, and sub-weapons is a treat and rewarding experience after putting it down. Where Mega Man is hard, tight, and a ranged platformer, Castlevania is the melee game to match. It remains to this day one of my favorite games and favorite franchises, where each entry adds something new or different to the formula, bearing the 3D titles. As the first game in the series, it's solid. It's a game I think every platformer fan should pick up at some point. However, after spanning 10 games in 10 years, Konami unleashed a new beast onto the world. Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Symphony of the Night reintroduces Alucard, Dracula's half-human, half-vampire son from Castlevania 3, with a specifically dark, romantic, gothic, and bishonen redesign and a sequel to his predecessor, Rondo of Blood. Symphony of the Night, upon first, second, and tertiary glances, is a work of art. The sprites look crisp, the animations are clean, the colors vibrant. Music is plentiful and memorable. Starting off, the game recounts Richter Belmont's final moments in his fight against Dracula in the previous game, and then goes on to introduce Alucard's headlong plunge into the castle before its gates shut him in. The very opening, the 5 seconds of Alucard's quick jump into this unexplored but not unexpected territory is everything we need to speak of his power and grace. He moves smoothly, different from any human or Belmont depicted thus far besides Eric Lacard and Bloodlines, his hair billowing and cloak flowing gently. He's thoroughly unexplored, and his environment gives him nothing to teach the player anything about him. To contrast with the original, Symphony is a brand new outing, and speaking on the subject, Koji Igarashi, the assistant director and in later stages of production, director of the game, and father of the Metroidvania staple of gameplay, said it was developed as something of a side story for the series. We were able to break a lot of Castlevania conventions and introduce a lot of new elements that we still use today. Symphony of the Night, from its outset, was designed to bring in more casual players, lower the difficulty, and appeal to players who spent a specific amount of money on a game and expected their money's worth. Though we appeal to game companies 20 years later with the same concerns, Igarashi cites seeing Castlevania games mounted in bargain bins as one of the biggest desires to change the franchise. We gave the player a lot of freedom because we wanted to lengthen the playtime for an action game, which is usually short. If people spend 5,800 yen, approximately $58 on a game, they should get 5,800 yen worth of enjoyment from it. Even when a game is very difficult, defeating enemies isn't very exciting, is it? I thought it would be fun for players to get experience from enemies and level up, so I added RPG elements. From the outset, the team aimed to do the following, which meant making the action exploration-based, though Castlevania 2 had already done so. Adding RPG elements in the game to enable anyone willing to put in the effort to finish it. No more one-hit kills, which we can assume means pits and spikes. No whip, which was a design change implemented by the chains of 32-bit. A larger player character meant that the whip would extend across the entire screen, even further than Super 4. No more stairs, but only in the context of previous Castlevania stairs. Changing the visual style. Castlevania's Simon Belmont sported a sleeker look that bulked up over the years, leaving Belmonts looking like hulking powerhouses with Morningstar-tipped whips. The team sought to use a more refined aesthetic to pump new life into the franchise, and for that reason specifically sought an artist inexperienced with game design for the team. But though we're able to check off each design change the team set out to make and mark them as accomplished, I see similar design flaws that cropped up in Super Metroid, though both games are amazing works in their own rights. It's no secret that both of these games have secret techniques, and Super Metroid has multitudes of more than Symphony, it seems, at first glance. Even the most basic things like wall jumping aren't explained in the manual or even in game unless we count being taught without button commands by tiny little creatures midway through. But that isn't near the end of it. There's shine sparking combined with directional jumping or storing, multi-bomb spread, plasma bombs, ice bombs, spacer bombs, and the crystal flash, none of which is demonstrated anywhere but by leaving the game to idle on the title screen. Even then, these are demonstrations and not a tutorial. On the other hand, with Symphony of the Night, a majority of the spells are sold by the Master Librarian in the long library, but there's still a few, Wolf Charge, Wing Smash, and Sword Brothers, that never get shown to the player or even hinted at. Luckily, once performed, the game records them in a subscreen in the menu. Many of the game's spells, like Super Metroid, take trial and error gameplay to find their true usefulness, and in the hands of a speedrunner feel like truly amazing skills. Soul Steel and Hellfire can be co-opted into a life-saving or movement technique depending on usage, with one healing you but damaging enemies, and the other teleporting Alucard a small distance and rendering him invulnerable until the spell completes. For both a first-time player and veteran, Summon Spirit and Tetra Spirit can make early bosses trivial for anybody with nimble fingers and a cool head. Beyond spells, some, but not all weapons have special techniques which are never recorded or explained in the game, akin to Super Metroid's special charge beam attacks and Crystal Flash. The Alucard sword, which Alucard starts the game with, has a secret down, forward, and forward attack input that unleashes a screen-wide teleport and dual slash at the cost of MP. But some are back to forward, or even both attack buttons at once. The hidden nature of multiple secret, unexplained techniques make this game a pleasure to explore and learn even after completing it normally. Thanks to its Metroidvania styling, Symphony of the Night uses abilities as keys, much like many other games, but especially similar to the ways that both Zelda and Super Metroid gate progress behind items like the hookshot, the power glove, missiles, space jump, and gravity suit. Of Symphony's abilities and transformations, Wolf, Bat, Mist, Double and High Jump, 2, Wolf Form and High Jump, are optional to entirely beat the game, but make fully finishing the map faster. Bat Form allows Alucard to fly while consuming MP and makes the Clock Tower and Richter boss fight accessible, meaning the player can reach the game's first ending as well as the inverted castle. Mist Form is an ability that lets Alucard become intangible for a moment and also lets you pass through 2 gates, the first being the one that teaches you that Mist can pass through these barriers, and the second leading to the soul of Bat. Besides being cool, the ability to shapeshift connects Alucard to his father, who is rumored to assume the form of bats, wolves, and Mist itself. However, unlike A Link to the Past or Super Metroid, the games that came before and inspired some of Symphony's gameplay, where the weapons and abilities retain usefulness after their initial key-like usage, many of Symphony's key abilities fail to be drastically useful outside of plot-advancing gameplay. Of the plot-advancing relics in the game, only the Leapstone dramatically changes gameplay outside of gathering the other relics. For anyone well-versed in Symphony's gameplay arc, the relic sequence to complete the first castle and get into the second is Leapstone, Form of Mist, Soul of Bat, and then Echo of Bat. Echo of Bat, outside of a single room, is completely useless in exploratory gameplay. These key-like abilities and much of the relic system is where Symphony of the Night detracts from itself. Most of the relics empower the Wolf, Bat, and Mist forms, but are scattershot in their location or are rewards for post-game exploration on the way to the final ending. While Bat form is essential to finishing the game, Wolf form feels like a reference to the Speed Booster or Pegasus Boots, upgrades that are useful in their own respective games, but in Symphony there is no item or area in the game that is Wolf only. Taken from its initial inspiration, the worlds of Super Metroid and A Link to the Past are plentiful with the things their key items affect. There are always rocks or pots to pick up, landscape to attach to, or enemies to stun with the hookshot. There's always a reason to use a missile in Super Metroid. Though Symphony of the Night's key abilities are fun, they're underutilized and sadly aren't very attached to the world that they make up. Relics, for the most part, unlock more of the game to the player, making it more RPG-like within the first 15 minutes. The first, the Cube of Zoe, enables items to drop from candles like prior games, and later relics of the same nature affect the game's user interface. In conjunction with increasing the length of the game, however, a third of the other relics fall short of being great. Familiars, helpful allies that fight alongside Alucard in his quest to defeat his father, can be found around the castle as you explore. The key caveat about them is that by the time you get one, they'll forever be useless. For what it's worth, the fairy can help and heal you at any level, and the demon can press switches in a few walls Alucard can't. Besides that, the familiars gain experience too slowly and require so high a level to be truly useful that they end up being the opposite, unfortunately. To be any sort of helpful, one would have to beeline to the familiar of their choice, then play solely with that one for the remainder of the game. The last set of relics consists of stat increases gained by defeating bosses in the inverted castle. They echo what Simon Belmont did at Castlevania 2, gathering the remains of the Great Lord to summon him. Each item, the ring, heart, rib, tooth, and eye of Vlad, increase a specific individual stat by 10 and inoculate against curse. These relics are inoffensive if unexplained. They simply add stats and allow Alucard to open the way into Dracula's chamber in the anti-castle. Items for the most part are rather lackluster. Once Alucard is outfitted with weapons of your choice, there's little to do but manage them every once in a while when you come across something new. For some fields like cloaks or trinkets, they are few in number and upgrades feel real and tangible, with cloaks changing Alucard's sprite at the same time adding magical defense. They're essentially the most customizable fun of the game, with some of them able to change color or even make the cloaks pixel semi-transparent on the outside. Trinkets, being rings, necklaces, and a few other items, can be equipped to do anything from add 24 attack and subtract 24 defense, double MP restoration, or even make Alucard's sprite just a little taller. Changing them throughout the game becomes personal preference for either attack or defense, versus adding an effect that will make Alucard's other stats recharge faster or change in concept. Sub-weapons, on the other hand, feel worthless. Because exploring the castle is non-linear, there's rarely a need for the classics. The dagger, since it flies so fast and is screen wide, ends up the most viable option, costing 1 heart and being near spammable in medium range. The sub-weapons nearly make up for being so weak by requiring a low ammunition cost that's plentiful no matter where one is in the castle. Weapons, shield, and armor play less of a role in feeling like real upgrades because of how the game works. Since the player ends up roaming the first castle far longer than the second, many of the new things they come across end up being on par or worse than what's currently available. Finding items beyond that is so random for the most part that the inventory ends up clogged up with things that you won't use, be they weapons, shields, health, or attack items. Without any way to sell or remove items, sorting items, which goes unexplained for the most part, but is available, is the only real way to keep a somewhat managed inventory. Ideally, as the player moves around the castle, they'll stumble upon either items or relics frequently enough that it feels good to explore and change the way that the game plays. Aside from Symphony's systems, the gameplay is straightforward. Enemies, both returning from Round of Blood and completely new, line the halls of the castle and keep you from freely exploring. Combat feels good, with Alucard's slick controls and fluid maneuverability, although now, this kind of combat is standard in Castlevanias and many Metroidvanias at the time it was new, different and significantly less clunky than the big bad Belmont whipping action. The slower, classic enemies are easily outclassed with the series' staple jumping attack before touching the ground, called short hopping or animation canceling, and the newer ones, quicker, fiercer, and less stationary. Though compared to the original games, combat-based exploration doesn't necessarily feel as tense. There's still significant knockback, but without pits or a relatively small pool of health, everything feels less tense and far easier than the first game. Where boss fights in the classic game felt like climactic finales to highly skilled endurance races, Symphony's bosses feel different, but in a good way. Since save rooms are numerous and plentiful, usually adjacent to the boss on the map or not far off, bosses can kill you in a few hits and hit hard. The addition of save rooms, however, allows for more trial and error gameplay, harder hitting enemies, and bosses with many differing types of attacks. Symphony of the Night takes full advantage of this with boss fights, making up for the more lackluster feel of dispatching regular enemies instead of the formerly tense, knuckle-whitening combat of the more agile enemies in titles past. On the whole, enemies and situations in the reverse castle are harder, since the first castle can be explored in any order before the difficulty ramp. Besides boss battles, the clock tower, reverse caverns, Black Marble Gallery and Floating Catacombs are the only real areas where the combat feels like it's balanced on the knife's edge. The enemies in these areas swarm Alucard, and what is usually 2-on-1 in most fights easily becomes 4 or 5-on-1, with numerous knockbacks and attacks to look out for. In the Reverse Caverns, Venus Weeds and Rock Knights team up with Cave Trolls to make seemingly one-on-one fights into dangerous multi-enemy battles. Though Rock Knights have one gimmick, the Venus Weeds have vines to look out for from the ground and throw roses at the player like darts. The original Castlevania and Symphony of the Night are beasts of the same ilk, cut from similar cloth, although completely different in feel and gameplay despite both being platformers. Mechanically, I find the original to be a better realized game than its sequel. The original is tense, with rigid combat, tight platforming, and acrobatic and slippery enemies. Castlevania has a bit of a knack for the unfair, leading the players into traps that only quick wits and quicker thumbs can evade. Though difficult, it's fair, and anybody willing to put in the time can learn to complete the game. Its biggest flaw by far is its difficulty, much of which stems from enemy setups in stages 3 and later, requiring players to anticipate the movements of enemies like fleamen and skeletons in places where multiple of them appear at once or even combined with each other. The fun, though, is in fighting your way through these hordes and seemingly impossible situations. The sequel, Symphony of the Night, is robust, filled with mystery, exploration, and a much larger, longer experience overall. For all the guff I give it and the flaws I find with it, I love Symphony of the Night. It's where my love affair with Metroidvania started, which subsequently became what I was known for among my friends. My taste for retro-inspired, difficult games requiring precise movements, rhythms, and timing. I played Symphony of the Night long ago when it first released, and most summers ever since, once a year. I know more about it than I should, think about it more than I need, and talk about it and its predecessor more than anyone I know. It's an easy experience due to its level design, enemy placements, and RPG systems. It underutilizes its own abilities on a first outing in this new explorative style, underexplains them, and leaves little time for them to shine. The constant finding of weapons and one-use items always almost feels unimportant after the early game, as most of them aren't upgrades after a few hours but rather down or side grades into the reverse castle. But there's something about Symphony of the Night that will always keep me coming back. It's the movement. The way Alucard hangs in the air during a jump or after dropkicking an enemy. It's in the way he smashes into the ceiling after a gravity jump and clings there with real momentum and weight. The way the sprite actually stops and turns around, no matter how quick he actually does it. The quick sword slashes and the development of short hopping, slashing gameplay the series became known for, the haunting, beautiful music and crisp sound effects. The transformations, there's something in the spectacle of boss fights, the opening of secrets and finding life and heart max-ups. The fact that the gameplay and its presentation are king here, while the story takes a backseat to the gorgeous sprite and animation work. Symphony of the Night gave new life to the Castlevania franchise, and as beautiful as it is, succeeded in making Alucard his own character with his own eccentricities and mannerisms. Though mechanically I prefer the original, the sense of polish, the sense of style, and the emphasis of taking on this new character means I will always recommend its sequel over it. Despite feeling like it misses its mark in so many ways, Symphony of the Night is such a solid package that can easily be forgiven or overlooked. I still own the original, but I'll always suggest a PlayStation Network or Xbox Arcade versions for ease of accessibility. For an all-in-one experience though, Castlevania The Dracula X Chronicles for the PSP is packaged with Round of Blood and it features a new voice cast for Symphony of the Night. It's easily the most accessible version for anybody playing both titles in one package. Thank you for listening.